Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could be here this Wednesday afternoon. Hope it's going well for you. We are reading War of the Worlds, and we'll start with chapter 12 for today. 12 and 13, I think we'll be able to get through throughout the meeting this time. Hopefully, you're reading along. If you have access to a computer, you can always download an e-book version, or you can see it on your computer if you go to Project Gutenberg. There is a link to the ebook format for this. It is a freely available book, so hopefully you can see this and you can read along with us and join in the fun. Hello, Arlene. So glad you could be here today. Um, just to recap the story very quickly, our unnamed protagonist has seen the cylinders, massive cylinders, land in England. There have been three that have landed so far, although astronomers have been saying that there were 10 total that were launched from Mars. Their first impression of the Martians wasn't really that good. They looked sort of like giant brown leathery octopi, and with tentacles, and they were just sort of ugly looking and didn't seem very capable, especially in the increased gravity of Earth. They would have to struggle to do anything in a way that we would not, and so nobody really thought much of it until, of course, the heat ray it comes out of the pit that they had landed in and starts burning the area, including any people that might have been in the way of it as well. And and so now everyone is running. Everyone has run, trying to get away from this. The cylinder has been or transformed, or they have made another machine that is on three legs. These tripods that are walking around with shooting the heat ray and causing mayhem and death wherever they go. And so far, we have had two of these tripods walking around in this area and in the English area of Woking, and which, if you saw my post yesterday, you see that they actually have a replica, a statue of one of the tripods in the actual English town of Woking as a memorial to H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds story. So there are two of them that are currently walking around. There is a third cylinder that has landed, but it has not stood up on the three legs yet. And our hero has left his wife in a town called Leatherhead, and he has gone back to his own house to try and salvage what he can. And there he has met one of the surviving artillerymen, someone who did not die in the heat ray, who has no name, is only known as the artilleryman. And the two of them decide to team up during this time of crisis. And that kind of brings us up to date to our story. And if you are ready, then we'll start chapter 12 of War of the Worlds, entitled What I Saw of the Destruction of Weybridge and Shepperton. As the dawn grew brighter, we withdrew from the window where we had watched the Martians, went quietly downstairs. Hold on just a second. There we go. I should have done that before, but I didn't, so there we go. It's a reminder to me. The artilleryman agreed with me that the house was no place to stay in. He proposed, he said, to make his way Londonward, and thence his battery, number 12 of the Horse Artillery. My plan was to return at once to Leatherhead, and so greatly had the strength of the Martians impressed me that I determined to take my wife to New Haven and go with her out of the country forthwith. for I already perceived clearly that the country about London must inevitably be the scene of a disastrous struggle before such creatures as these could be destroyed. Between us and Leatherhead, however, lay the third cylinder, with its guarding giants. Had I been alone, I think I should have taken my chance and struck across country, but the artillerymen dissuaded me. "It's no kindness to the right sort of wife," he said, "to make her a widow." In the end, I agreed to go with him under cover of the woods northward as far as Street Cobham before I parted with him. Thence I could make a big detour by Epsom to reach Leatherhead. I would have started at once, but my companion had been in active service and knew better than that. He made me ransack the house for a flask which he filled with whiskey, and we lined every available pocket with packets of biscuits and slices of meat. Then we crept out of the house and ran as quickly as we could down the ill-made road by which I had come the night before. The houses seemed deserted. In the road lay 3 charred bodies close together, struck dead by the heat ray. And here and there were things that people had dropped: a clock, a slipper, a silver spoon. At the corner, turning up toward the post office, a little cart filled with boxes and furniture, and, horseless, heeled over on a broken wheel. A cash box had been hastily smashed open and thrown under the debris. Except for the lodge at the orphanage, which was still on fire, none of the houses had suffered greatly here. The heat ray had shaved the chimney tops and passed. Yet, save ourselves, there did not seem to be a living soul on Maybury Hill. The majority of the inhabitants had escaped, I suppose, by way of the old Woking road, the road I had taken when I drove to Leatherhead, or they had hidden. We went down the lane, past the body of the man in black, sodden now from the overnight hail, and broke into the woods at the foot of the hill. We pushed through them toward the railway without meeting a soul. The woods across the line were scarred and blackened ruins. For the most part the trees had fallen, but a certain proportion still stood, dismal gray trunks with dark brown instead of green foliage. On our side the fire had done no more than scorch the nearer trees. It had failed to secure its footing. In one place the woodmen had been at work on Saturday. Trees felled and freshly trimmed lay in a clearing, with heaps of sawdust by the sawing machine and its engine. Nearby was a temporary hut, deserted. There was not a breath of wind this morning, and everything was strangely still. Even the birds were hushed, and as we hurried along, the artilleryman and I talked in whispers and looked now and again over our shoulders. Once or twice we stopped to listen. After a time we drew near the road. As we did so we heard the clatter of hoofs, and saw through the trees 3 cavalry soldiers riding slowly toward Woking. We hailed them, and they halted while we hurried toward them. It was a lieutenant and a couple of privates of the 8th Hussars, with a stand like a theodolite, which the artilleryman told me was a heliograph. Now I'm going to stop here just for a moment, because I had to look up both of these, and remember, I looked them up, so you don't have to. A theodolite is like surveying equipment. So, if you can imagine, it's kind of on its own kind of tripod, this little device that you would use for surveying. But of course, the tripod is already being used to describe the Martians and their giant vehicles, so you can't really say that. So in this case, he called it a theodolite, which is apparently not what it is. It was, in fact, a heliograph, and a heliograph, if you didn't know, because I didn't, is a device that has a mirror in it that is used to send signals by reflected light. So you can move the mirror, and the light will flash, and that will be a signal for getting messages across long distances before the age of cell phones and stuff. So even though it looked like a piece of surveying equipment, it was in fact a mirror-based form of signaling. "You are the first men I've seen coming this way this morning," said the lieutenant. "What's brewing?" His voice and face were eager. The men behind him stared curiously. The artilleryman jumped down the bank into the road and saluted. "Gun destroyed last night, sir. Have been hiding. Trying to rejoin batteries, sir. You'll come in sight of the Martians, I expect, about half a mile along this road." "What the dickens are they like?" said the lieutenant. "Giants in armor, sir, 100 feet high, 3 legs and a body like aluminum, with a mighty great head in a hood, sir." "Get out," said the lieutenant. "What confounded nonsense!" "You'll see, sir. They carry a kind of box, sir, that shoots fire and strikes you dead." "What do you mean? A gun?" "No, sir," said the artilleryman, and the artilleryman gave a vivid account of the heat ray. Halfway through, the lieutenant interrupted him and looked up at me. I was still standing on the bank by the side of the road. "It's perfectly true," I said. "Well," said the lieutenant, "I suppose it's my business to see it too. Look here," to the artillerymen. "We're detailed here, clearing people out of their houses. You'd better go along and report yourself to Brigadier General Marvin, and tell him all you know. He's at Weybridge. Know the way?" "I do," I said. The lieutenant turned his horse southward again. "Half a mile, you say?" said he. "At most," I answered, and pointed over the treetops southward. He thanked me and rode on, and we saw them no more. Farther along, we came upon a group of 3 women and 2 children in the road, busy clearing out a laborer's cottage. They had got hold of a little hand truck and were piling it up with unclean-looking bundles and shabby furniture. They were all too assiduously engaged to talk to us as we passed. By Byfleet Station, we emerged from the pine trees and found the country calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight. We were far beyond the range of the heat ray there, and had it not been for the silent desertion of some of the houses, the stirring movement of packing in others, and the knot of soldiers standing on the bridge over the railway and staring down the line toward Woking, the day would have seemed like any other Sunday. Several farm wagons and carts were moving creakily along the road to Addlestone, and suddenly, through the gate of a field, we saw across a stretch of flat meadow 6 12-pounders standing neatly at equal distances, pointing toward Woking. 12-pounders are cannons. The gunners stood by the guns, waiting, and the ammunition wagons were at a businesslike distance. The men stood almost as if they were under inspection. "That's good," said I. "They will get one fair shot, at any rate." The artilleryman hesitated at the gate. "I shall go on," he said. Further on, toward Weybridge, just over the bridge, there were a number of men in white fatigue jackets throwing up a long rampart and more guns behind. "It's bows and arrows against the lightning anyhow," said the artilleryman. "They haven't seen that fire beam yet." The officers, who were not actively engaged, stood and stared over the treetops southwestward, and the men digging would stop every now and again to stare in the same direction. Byfleet was in a tumult. People were packing, and a score of hussars, some of them dismounted, some on horseback, were shunting them about. 3 or 4 black government wagons with crosses in white circles, and an old omnibus, among other vehicles, were being loaded in the village street. There were scores of people, most of them sufficiently sabbatical to have assumed their best clothes. The soldiers were having the greatest difficulty in making them realize the gravity of their position. We saw one shriveled old fellow with a huge box and a score or more of flower pots containing orchids, angrily expostulating with the corporal, who would have him leave them behind. I stopped and gripped his arm. "Do you know what's over there?" I said, pointing to the pine tops that hid the Martians. "Eh?" said he, turning. "I was explaining that these is valuable." "Death!" I shouted. "Death is coming! Death!" And, leaving him to digest that, if he could, I hurried on, after the artillerymen. At the corner I looked back. The soldier had left, but the old fellow still stood by his box, with his pots of orchids on the lid of it, staring vaguely over the trees. No one in Weybridge could tell us where the headquarters were established. The whole place was in confusion, such as I had never seen before. Carts and carriages everywhere, the most astonishing miscellany of conveyances and horseflesh. The respectable inhabitants of the place, men in golf and boating costumes and prettily dressed wives, were packing, riverside loafers energetically helping, children excited and for the most part highly delighted at this astonishing variation in their Sunday experiences. In the midst of it all the worthy vicar was holding an early celebration, and his bell jangled out above the excitement. The artillerymen and I seated ourselves on the step of the drinking fountain and made a very passable meal upon what we had brought with us. Patrols of soldiers, here no longer hussars, but grenadiers in white, were warning people to move now or take refuge in their cellars as soon as the firing began. We saw as we crossed the railway bridge that a growing crowd of people had assembled in and about the railway station, and the swarming platform was piled with boxes and packages. The ordinary traffic had been stopped, I believe, in order to allow of the passage of troops and guns to Chertsey, and I have heard since that a savage struggle occurred for places in the special trains put on at a later hour. We remained at Weybridge until midday, when we found ourselves at the place near Shepperton Lock, where the Wey and Thames join. Part of the time we spent helping two old women pack a little cart. The Wey has a treble mouth, and at this point boats could be hired, and there was a ferry across the river. On the Shepperton side was an inn with a lawn, and beyond that the tower of Shepperton Church. It had been replaced by a spire that rose above the trees. Here we found an excited and noisy crowd of fugitives. As yet, the flight had not grown into a panic, but there were already far more people than all the boats going to and fro could carry across. People came along, panting under heavy burdens. One husband and wife carried a small outhouse door between them and some of their household goods piled thereon. One man told us he meant to try to get away from the Shepperton station. There was a lot of shouting, and one man was even jesting. People here seemed to think the Martians were simply formidable human beings who might attack and sack the town, to be certainly destroyed in the end. Every now and then they would glance nervously across the way at the meadows towards Chertsey, but all was still there. Across the Thames, except where the boats landed, everything was quiet. In vivid contrast with the Surrey side, people who landed there from the boats were tramping off down the lane. The big ferry boat had just made a journey. 3 or 4 soldiers stood on the lawn of the inn, staring and jesting at the fugitives without offering to help. The inn was closed, as it was now within prohibited hours. "What's that?" cried a boatman, and "Shut up, you fool!" said a man near me to a yelping dog. Then the sound came again, this time from the direction of Chertsey, a muffled thud, the sound of a gun. The fighting was beginning. Almost immediately, batteries across the river to our right, unseen because of the trees, took up the chorus, firing heavily one after the other. A woman screamed. Everyone stood, arrested by the sudden stir of battle near us, and yet invisible to us. Nothing was to be seen save flat meadows, cows feeding unconcernedly, for the most part, and a silvery pollard willows motionless in the warm sunlight. "The soldiers'll stop 'em," said a woman beside me, doubtfully. A haziness rose over the treetops. Then suddenly we saw a rush of smoke far away up the river, a puff of smoke that jerked up into the air and hung there. Forthwith the ground heaved underfoot, and a heavy explosion shook the air, smashing 2 or 3 windows in the houses near. "Here they are!" shouted a man in a blue jersey. "Yonder! Do you see them? Yonder!" Quickly, one after the other, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the armored Martians appeared. Far away over the little trees, across the flat meadows that stretched towards Chertsey, and striding hurriedly toward the river. Little cowled figures they seemed at first, going with a rolling motion, and as fast as flying birds. Then, advancing obliquely toward us, came a fifth. Their armored bodies glittered in the sun as they swept swiftly forward upon the guns, growing rapidly larger as they drew near. The one on the extreme left, the remotest one, flourished a huge case high in the air, and the ghostly, terrible heat ray I had already seen on Friday night smote toward Chertsey and struck the town. At sight of these strange, swift, and terrible creatures, the crowd near the water's edge seemed to be for a moment horror-struck. There was no screaming or shouting, but a silence. Then a hoarse murmur, and a movement of feet, and a splashing from the water. A man too frightened to drop his portmanteau, he carried on his shoulder, swung around, and sent me staggering with a blow from the corner of his burden. A woman thrust at me with her hand and rushed past me. I turned with the rush of people, but I was not too terrified for thought. The terrible heat ray was in my mind. To get under water, that was it. "Get under water!" I shouted, unheeded. I faced about again and rushed toward the approaching Martian, rushed right down at the gravelly beach and headlong into the water. Others did the same. A boatload of people, putting back, came leaping out as I rushed past. The stones under my feet were muddy and slippery, and the river was so low that I ran perhaps 20 feet, scarcely waist deep. Then, as the Martian towered overhead, scarcely 200 yards away, I flung myself forward under the surface. The splashes of the people in the boats leaping into the river sounded like thunderclaps in my ears. People were landing hastily on both sides of the river. But the Martian machine took no more notice for the moment of the people running this way and that than a man would of the confusion of ants in a nest against which his foot has kicked. When, half suffocated, I raised my head above water, the Martian hood pointed at the batteries that were still firing across the river. As it advanced, it swung loose what must have been the generator of the heat ray. In another moment it was on the bank, and in a stride wading halfway across. The knees of its foremost legs bent at the farther bank, and in another moment it had raised itself to its full height again, close to the village of Shepperton. Forthwith, the 6 guns, which, unknown to anyone on the right bank, had been hidden behind the outskirts of the village, fired simultaneously. The sudden near concussion, the last close upon the first, made my heart jump. The monster was already raising the case, generating the heat ray as the first shell burst 6 yards above the hood. I gave a cry of astonishment. I saw and thought nothing of the other 4 Martian monsters. My attention was riveted upon the nearer incident. Simultaneously, 2 other shells burst in the air near the body as the hood twisted around in time to receive, but not in time to dodge, the 4th shell. The shell burst clean in the face of the thing. The hood bulged, flashed, and whirled off in a dozen tattered fragments of red flesh and glittering metal. "Hit!" shouted I, with something between a scream and a cheer. I heard answering shouts from the people in the water about me. I could have leapt out of the water with that momentary exultation. The decapitated colossus reeled like a drunken giant, but it did not fall over. It recovered its balance, by a miracle, and, no longer heeding its steps, and with the camera that fired the heat ray now rigidly upheld, it reeled swiftly upon Shepperton. The living intelligence, the Martian within the hood, was slain, and splashed to the 4 winds of heaven, and the thing was now but a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction. It drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of Shepperton Church, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram might have done, swerved aside, blundered on, and collapsed with tremendous force into the river out of my sight. A violent explosion shook the air, and a spout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot up far into the sky. As the camera of the heat ray hit the water, the latter had immediately flashed into steam. In another moment, a huge wave, like a muddy tidal, bore but almost scalding hot, came sweeping around the bend upstream. I saw people struggling shorewards and heard their screaming and shouting faintly above the seething roar of the Martian's collapse. For a moment I heeded nothing of the heat, forgot the patent need of self-preservation. I splashed through the tumultuous water, pushing aside a man in black to do so, until I could see around the bend. Half a dozen deserted boats pitched aimlessly upon the confusion of the waves. The fallen Martian came into sight downstream, lying partially submerged across the river. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage, and through the tumultuously swirling wisps I could see, intermittently and vaguely, the gigantic limbs churning the water and flinging a splash and spray of mud and froth into the air. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms, and save for the helpless purposelessness of these movements, it was as if some wounded thing were struggling for its life amid the waves. Enormous quantities of a ruddy brown fluid were spurting up in noisy jets out of the machine. My attention was diverted from this death flurry by a furious yelling, like that of the thing called a siren in our manufacturing towns. A man knee-deep near the towing path shouted inaudibly to me and pointed. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the riverbank from the direction of Chertsey. The Shepperton guns spoke this time unavailingly. At that, I ducked at once underwater, and holding my breath until movement was an agony, blundered painfully ahead under the surface as long as I could. The water was in a tumult about me and rapidly growing hotter. When for a moment I raised my head to take a breath and throw the hair and water from my eyes, the steam was rising in a whirling white fog that at first hid the Martians altogether. The noise was deafening. Then I saw them dimly, colossal figures of gray, magnified by the mist. They had passed me, and two were stooping over the frothing, tumultuous ruin of their comrade. The third and fourth stood beside them in the water, one perhaps 200 yards from me, the other toward Lelehem. The generators of the heat rays waved high, and the hissing beams smote down this way and that. The air was full of sound, a deafening and confusing conflict of noises. The clangorous din of the Martians, the crash of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences, sheds flashing into flame, and the crackling and roaring of fire. Dense black smoke was leaping up to mingle with the steam from the river, and as the heat ray went to and fro over Weybridge, its impact was marked by flashes of incandescent white that gave place at once to a smoky dance of lurid flames. The nearer houses stood intact, awaiting their fate, shadowy, faint, and pallid in the stream, with the fire burning behind them. For a moment, perhaps, I stood there, breast high in the almost boiling water, dumbfounded at my position, hopeless of escape. Through the reek, I could see the people who had been with me in the river scrambling out of the water through the reeds, like little frogs hurrying through grass from the advance of a man or running to and fro in utter dismay on the towing path. Then suddenly the white flashes of the heat ray came leaping toward me. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch, and the flames darted out. The trees changed to fire with a roar. The ray flickered up and down the towing path, licking off the people who ran this way and that, and came down to the water's edge not 50 yards from where I stood. It swept across the river to Shepperton, and the water in its tracks rose in a boiling wheel crested with steam. I turned shoreward. In another moment the huge wave, well nigh at the boiling point, had rushed upon me. I screamed aloud, and, scalded, half-blinded, agonized, I staggered through the leaping, hissing water toward the shore. Had my foot stumbled, it would have been the end. I fell helplessly in full sight of the Martians upon the broad, bare, gravelly spit that runs down to mark the angle of the Wey and Thames. I expected nothing but death. I have a dim memory of the foot of a Martian coming down within a score of yards of my head, driving straight into the loose gravel, whirling it this way and that, and lifting again, of a long suspense, and then of the four carrying the debris of their comrade between them, now clear, and then presently faint through the veil of smoke, receding interminably, as it seemed to me, across a vast space of river and meadow. And then very slowly I realized that by a miracle I had escaped. Chapter 13. How I Fell In with the Curate. After getting this sudden lesson in the power of terrestrial weapons, the Martians retreated to their original position upon Horsell Common. In their haste, and encumbered with the debris of their smashed companion, they no doubt overlooked many such a stray and negligible victim as myself. Had they left their comrade and pushed on forthwith, There was nothing at that time between them and London but batteries of 12-pounder guns, and they would certainly have reached the capital in advance of their tidings of their approach, as sudden, dreadful, and destructive their advent would have been as the earthquake that destroyed Lisbon more than a century ago. But they were in no hurry. Cylinder followed cylinder on its interplanetary flight. Every 24 hours brought them reinforcement. And meanwhile, the military and naval authorities, now fully alive to the tremendous power of their antagonists, worked with furious energy. Every minute a fresh gun came into position until before twilight every copse, every row of suburban villas on the hilly slopes about Kingston and Richmond masked an expectant black muzzle. And through the charred and desolate area, perhaps 20 square miles altogether, that encircled the Martians' encampment on Horsell Common, through charred and ruined villages among the green trees, through the blackened and smoking arcades that had been but a day ago pine spinneys, crawled the devoted scouts with the heliographs that were presently to warn the gunners of the Martian approach. But the Martians now understood our command of artillery and the danger of human proximity, and not a man ventured within a mile of either the cylinder save at the price of his life. It would seem that these giants spent the earlier part of the afternoon in going to and fro, transferring everything from the second and third cylinders, the second in Addlestone Golf Links and the third at Pierford, to their original pit on Horsell Common. Over that, above the blackened heather and ruined buildings that stretched far and wide, stood one as a sentinel, while the rest abandoned their vast fighting machines and descended into the pit. They were hard at work there far into the night, and the towering pillar of dense green smoke that rose therefrom could be seen from the hills about Merrow, and even, it is said, from Banstead and Epsom Downs. And while the Martians behind me were thus preparing for their next sally, and in front of me, humanity gathered for the battle, I made my way with infinite pains and labor from the fire and smoke of burning Weybridge toward London. I saw an abandoned boat, very small and remote, drifting downstream. Throwing off most of my sodden clothes, I went after it, gained it, and so escaped out of that destruction. There were no oars in the boat, but I contrived to paddle as well as my parboiled hands would allow down the river toward Halliford and Walton, going very tediously and continually looking behind me, as you may well understand. I followed the river because I considered that the water gave me my best chance of escape should these giants return. The hot water from the Martians' overthrow drifted downstream with me, so that for the best part of a mile I could see little of either bank. Once, however, I made out a string of black figures hurrying across the meadows from the direction of Weybridge. Halliford, it seemed, was deserted, and several of the houses facing the river were on fire. It was strange to see the place quite tranquil, quite desolate, under the hot blue sky, with the smoke and little threads of flame going straight up into the heat of the afternoon. Never before had I seen houses burning without accompaniment of an obstructive crowd. A little further on, the dry weeds up the bank were smoking and glowing, and a line of fire inland was marching steadily across a field of hay. For a long time I drifted. So painful and weary was I after the violence I had been through, and so intense the heat upon the water. Then my fears got the better of me again, and I resumed my paddling. The sun scorched my bare back at last as the bridge at Walton was coming into sight around the bend, My fever and faintness overcame my fears, and I landed on the Middlesex bank and lay down, deadly sick, amid the long grass. I suppose the time was then about 4 or 5 o'clock. I got up presently, walked perhaps half a mile without meeting a soul, and then lay down again in the shadow of a hedge. I seem to remember talking wanderingly to myself during that last spurt. I was also very thirsty and bitterly regretful I had drunk no more water. It was a curious thing that I felt angry with my wife. I cannot account for it, but my impotent desire to reach Leatherhead worried me excessively. I do not clearly remember the arrival of the curate, so that I so that probably I dozed. I became aware of him as a seated figure in soot-smudged shirt sleeves and with his upturned, clean-shaven face staring at a faint flickering that danced over the sky. The sky was what is called a mackerel sky, rows and rows of faint down plumes of cloud just tinted with the midsummer sunset. I sat up, and at the rustle of my motion he turned and looked at me quickly. "Have you any water?" I asked abruptly. He shook his head. "You have been asking for water for the last hour," he said. For a moment we were silent, taking stock of each other. I dare say he found me a strange enough figure, naked save for my water-soaked trousers and socks, scalded, and with my face and shoulders blackened by the smoke. His face had a fair weakness, his chin retreated, and his hair lay in a crisp, almost flaxen curls on his low forehead. His eyes were rather large, pale blue, and blankly staring. He spoke abruptly, looking vacantly away from me. "What does it mean?" he said. "What do these things mean?" I stared at him and made no answer. He extended a thin, white hand and spoke in almost complaining tone. "Why are these things permitted? What sins have we done?" The morning service was over. I was walking through the roads to clear my brain for the afternoon, and then fire, earthquake, death, as if it were Sodom and Gomorrah, all our work undone, all the work. What are these Martians? "What are we?" I answered, clearing my throat. He gripped his knees and turned to look at me again. For half a minute, perhaps, he stared silently. "I was walking through the roads to clear my brain," he said, "and suddenly fire, earthquake, death." He relapsed into silence, with his chin now sunken almost to his knees. Presently he began waving his hand. "All the work, all the Sunday schools, what have we done? What has Weybridge done? Everything gone, everything destroyed. The church, we rebuilt it only 3 years ago. Gone, swept out of existence. Why?" Another pause. He broke out again, like one demented. "The smoke of her burning goeth up for ever and ever," he shouted. His eyes flamed, and he pointed a lean finger in the direction of Weybridge. By this time I was beginning to take his measure. The tremendous tragedy in which he had been involved, it was evident he was a fugitive from Weybridge, had driven him to the very verge of his reason. "Are we far from Sunbury?" I asked, in a matter-of-fact tone. "What are we to do?" he asked. "Are these creatures everywhere? Has the earth been given over to them?" "Are we far from Sunbury?" "Only this morning I officiated at early celebration." "Things have changed," I said quietly. "You must keep your head. There is still hope." "Hope!" "Yes, plentiful hope. in spite of all this destruction. I began to explain my view of our position. He listened at first, but as I went on, the interest dawning in his eyes gave place to their former stare, and his regard wandered. "This must be the beginning of the end," he said, interrupting me. "The end! The great and terrible day of the Lord, when men shall call upon the mountains and the rocks to fall upon them and hide them from the face of him that sitteth upon the throne." I began to understand the position. I ceased my labored reasoning, struggled to my feet, and, standing over him, laid my hand on his shoulder. "Be a man," said I. "You are scared out of your wits. What good is religion if it collapses under calamity? Think of what earthquakes and floods and wars and volcanoes have done before to men. Did you think God had exempted Weybridge? He is not an insurance agent." For a time he sat in blank silence. "But how can we escape?" he asked suddenly. "They are invulnerable. They are pitiless." "Neither the one nor perhaps the other," I answered. "And the mightier they are, the more sane and wary should we be. One of them was killed yonder not 3 hours ago." "Killed?" he said, staring about him. "How can God's ministers be killed?" "I saw it happen," I proceeded to tell him. "We have chanced to come in for the thick of it," said I, "and that's all." "What is that flicker in the sky?" he asked abruptly. I told him that it was the heliograph signaling, that it was the sign of human help and effort in the sky. "We are in the midst of it," I said. "Quiet as it is, that flicker in the sky tells of the gathering storm. Yonder, I take it, are the Martians, and Londonward, where those hills rise about Richmond and Kingston, and the trees give cover, earthworks are being thrown up and guns are being placed. Presently the Martians will be coming this way again." And even as I spoke, he sprang to his feet and stopped me by a gesture. "Listen," he said. From beyond the low hills across the water came the dull resonance of distant guns and a remote, weird crying. Then everything was still. A cockchafer came down droning over the hedge and past us. High in the west, the crescent moon hung faint and pale above the smoke of Weybridge and Shepperton, and the hot, still splendor of the sunset. "We had better follow this path," I said, "northward." And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 13. We will pick up on Friday. I hope you can join me. Friday at 4 p.m., we will start with chapter 14, entitled In London. So things are moving along, and we'll have to see what our unnamed protagonist sees going forward in this next chapter or two. Thank you for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've read along with me. And don't forget, we'll have some more information. I think I'll put up an example of a 12-pound gun on our Facebook page tomorrow, and so you can kind of get a good visual on that. And then we'll start again on Friday. So thank you very much for being here. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again. Bye, everyone.